Okay, on step number 8 is going to be your final sanding for your project. And you've already done some sanding to this through the time saver sander, or some other parts of your project have been sanded. But we've been adding pencil marks to this. There's probably glue smudges around as we were gluing it together. There's some sharp corners going on your legs and the top and other parts of this. And so we need to now do our final sanding. And you have to understand when you're sanding that there's different grits of sandpaper, and we want to work our way up to the highest grit for your final sanding. The sandpaper has the grit number written on the back of it, and there's what I supply is 80 grit, 150 grit, and 220 grit. Now there's also a whole bunch more grits that are available out there, but those are the 3 that I usually supply. And honestly, you probably don't even need to use the 80 grit unless you have some really major glue or heavy burns or something like that. So I would probably start off with the 150 grit is what I would choose. And again, we're going to just hit the entire thing. Pencil marks, glue, burn marks, scratches, table saw marks, anything on this that shouldn't be on there, we got to get it off. And focusing on sharp corners, softening those as well, and we'll show each of these processes. Also, you might have some cracks or holes or slot marks from your biscuit joiner, extra ones that you accidentally cut. Or for whatever reason, if you need to fill a hole or a crack, we'll show that process as well on how to hide some of those mistakes or some of those other gaps there. If the sandpaper on your sander is really worn out, we can peel that off and get a brand new piece here. We want to use these up until they're really worn out though, but just come talk to me if you need a new piece. I'm just going to go ahead and replace this with a new piece of 150 grit. And these ones are just stickers. We have other ones that are Velcro. But either one, we'll make sure we have a good piece of sandpaper on here. I'd recommend have a piece of carpet down when you're sanding. It's just to get rid of some of the vibration, also to protect your project as we're doing the sanding. So I would also recommend sand the inside of your table. Even though we're not going to see it that much, you just want to get the entire thing sanded on here. So we'll go ahead and get all those marks off sanding this project here. Okay, you're going to want to get into these corners here also. There might be pencil mark there or some glue or other things like that. And your sander should be able to get into those edges and corners easily. We want to get all those marks off. If you did a routed edge here with the groove, you might have to take a piece of scrap sandpaper and kind of fold it to match into those slots there to get anything there sanded. But we want to get all these little corners and edges as well. One little tip to help make this sanding process go a little faster and easier: when you're sanding with these sanders here, if you tweak the pressure of the sander just slightly to the side as it's sanding, that's going to get a lot more deeper sanding, more aggressive. If you just have it flat, it's going to sand, but it's going to take a little more time. Now we're not tilting the sander majorly, it's just a very small little bit of a tweak on that, so we're getting most of the pressure on the outer part of the sander instead of the middle part of the sander. So flat sanding, and then if you tweak it just a little bit, just up like that, it's going to get a little more aggressive and faster sanding on that. Okay, now we also want to make sure that we get all these sharp corners softened. And what I'm talking about, the corners of your legs, all 4 corners, anywhere someone might touch. So like on the underneath part of here, if this is not routed, round over, if it's flat, we need to soften that. On the inside underneath, and also don't forget your top. We need to make sure we soften all these corners of your top, anywhere there's a sharp edge. And when we go to soften this, we're not going to be rounding it over. So don't take your sander here and try to round over the corners. Instead, we're just going to take just a piece of scrap sandpaper. These are all over in that left tool cabinet in a cardboard box down below. Just grab a piece of used sandpaper here, and we're just going to hold it at an angle and then just kind of soften. It doesn't take very much, and you can feel the difference after you've softened it. Just held at an angle, and you can soften any of these sharp corners. Just enough that it's not going to be sharp. And hit all of those. And I would recommend probably some 150 grit, 220 grit, something like that when you're using that. Some of the harder to reach places can be done by hand as well. So if you've got a hard to reach area, sometimes by hand is a little easier than with the random orbit sanders. But get the entire project nice and smooth. You should not take too long with this though. If your sanding is taking you several days, that's too long. It shouldn't take more than maybe 20-30 minutes to get the entire thing sanded. Don't forget to sand your top as well. We want to get the top side and the bottom side. Even though you're not going to see much of the bottom side, we'll still feel a lot of that and see some of it. So we'll get everything sanded on your top. Again, softening the sharp corners as well. It's a good idea to sand with the grain. If you notice the grain direction on here, you want your sander to go in the same direction the grain is going anytime you're sanding any part of your project. Okay, I just finished sanding with 150 grit on everything, the top as well as our table. I've softened some sharp corners and all that. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the 220 grit sandpaper now. And it's just, again, really quick on the 220 grit. You don't need to spend as much time. You should have removed all of your pencil marks or other marks with the 150 grit, and then you'll hit it with the 220. Okay, for some of you, you might have some gaps or cracks or holes or defects or other things in your project, and you need to know how to fill those little spots there. Now, just the knots that maybe are open a little bit, typically I don't do any filling in with those at all. It's just a natural defect in the board. But if you have a crack or a gap or some other part of your project that maybe has a hole or other things like that, we can fill those in. If you want to fill in the knots, you can do that, not a problem. But I'm going to go ahead and leave all my knots open, which is, again, just a natural part of the wood. And so I'm not concerned about that. I did want to show you on this project, however, this one has a little crack in there. Now there's a knot here, I wouldn't worry about that, but a little crack right here going on the board, and maybe just it wasn't trimmed off when they glued it up. And so there's a couple ways we can fill this in. And one of them is with glue and sawdust, and the other is with some wood filler. I'm going to actually show you both techniques on this here. Okay, if you're going to use the wood filler, I've got different types and they're labeled. This one says alder for the color that it is, and I've got all the different types of wood filler like the alder, oak, maple, cherry, walnut. And we'll just take the lid off and we'll take a little putty knife, and you'll just get a little bit on your putty knife. You don't need a whole bunch, just a small little bit on that putty knife here. And then you're going to go ahead and just press that into the crack or gap or other things like that. And we can just use our putty knife to kind of smear it in there. You want to press down pretty hard and just get that to fill in those gaps and cracks. We let that dry. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes for that to dry, and then we can sand over that and it'll fill in all those holes and cracks and all that. Okay, after letting that sit and dry for about 10 or 15 minutes, it'll lighten up the color, it'll also harden up, then you can just sand over it. And then that'll fill in that crack. Now the other method, again, I've left a little bit of this crack still showing here to show you the other method, and that's you just take some glue and fill the little slot with some glue. Now, not very much. You can only do this on really small cracks. You can't really do this on the big open, big gaps. And just kind of press it into the little crack there. And then I would recommend get a piece of scrap sandpaper, and you're just going to sand away from the slot at first, that crack, and build up a little bit of sawdust. You're just building up just a little bit of this little sawdust stuff here. Then we'll go ahead and press pretty firmly right into the spot where the glue was mixed with it. And that glue will mix with that sawdust and fill in that crack there. So again, those are just two methods that you can use. Either one works fine, either the wood filler or just glue and sawdust technique. Fill in any gaps and cracks and anything like that on any part of your project. Okay, once you have your entire project sanded all the way through 220 grit, you'll notice when you put your top on here, if you look underneath, it does not sit perfectly tight. There's a little bit of a space right up in here. And that's because the top of our legs, where they meet on the side, they're angled a little bit. And so we need to sand this entire top part flat. And there's a couple ways we can do this. Now if you just try to take a sander and try to sand this whole thing flat, you're not going to get it flat. It's going to be kind of dipping down or angling a little bit. We want the entire thing perfectly flat. So don't try to take a sander and just sand the top of it. That's not going to get it flat. It might smooth it out, but it's not going to make it flat. And we want that sitting nice and tight. So I have two ways that we can do this. If you have any major differences, like your leg is sticking up a lot higher than the side, or your side is way higher than your leg, then we can go over to our disc or belt sander. We can tip this little table at an angle, and then we can bump the side of that. Have me help you with that if that's what we need to do. But for most of you, you're just going to be using a little sanding disc. I would just take these and just clamp them down so they don't move. We'll just put them on the edge of the bench here and just throw a little clamp on the two sides here. And then we're going to just rub it back and forth until we get the top of it flat. You'll start to see it sanding, so I'm just hitting the high spots right now. Eventually we want to get the entire thing flat. Now one little trick you can do, if you take a pencil or something and just kind of mark up the whole edge of this, just all the way around your whole project, then when you're sanding you can see when your pencil mark disappears, you'll know that you've hit that whole edge. So I just kind of mark up the whole outside here. Now as we go ahead and hit this on here, you'll see the pencil marks start to disappear on certain high spots here. So I've still got some low spots. I've got to keep going. And we're just about there. There's just a little bit more pencil mark on a few little spots here. Just got the top sanded on that disc, and if you place your top back on here, you'll notice underneath there, now there's no gap at all. It sits nice and tight all the way around your whole table. You've sanded your name off completely, so we do need to rewrite your name. Now I would write it on a spot that's going to get covered up later, so I'd maybe up on this top edge here, get your name written there. And then also on your top, get your name written on the bottom side of your top underneath where it's not going to be seen later. But we do want to have your name written on all
these projects again, just so we don't mix them up, whose is whose. And once you get your entire project sanded, and take some time with this, make it look good. Soften all those sharp corners, get all the glue off, the pencil marks, everything. Make it really good all the way up to 220 grit sandpaper. You'll come get my signature.